This video is dedicated to Don Cat Love, winner of our community challenge. Thank you for your support and engagement with this research. March 19th, 1945. Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu, Japan. The base sits in the southern part of Japan's largest island. By March, the war is effectively over for Japan. Everyone knows it. The Americans are island hopping closer every week. Supply lines are cut, fuel is rationed, and yet the military keeps sending young men on one-way flights. On this particular morning, the base is preparing a special Kamikaze mission. 12 pilots have been selected. They are young, most in their early 20s. They are volunteers, or at least that's what the official records claim. They have been chosen because they are considered the most stable, the most psychologically sound pilots available. The mission briefing is scheduled for dawn. The sortie is scheduled for 0600 hours. But what happens between 0230 and 0300 hours, in the hours immediately before dawn, will change the understanding of what's happening at this base, though almost nobody will ever know about it. What we know comes from 3 sources. First, there are the official military psychiatric reports filed by Dr. Eiji Matsushita, the medical officer assigned to Kanoya Air Base. Matsushita was not some junior enlisted man. He was a trained psychiatrist, educated in both traditional Japanese medicine and contemporary Western psychiatric practice. He had been observing kamikaze pilots since 1944. He understood psychological breakdown. He understood stress responses. He understood hallucination. Second, there is the written report filed by Captain Yamamoto Yoshio, the base commander. Yamamoto was not a paranormal enthusiast. He was a military officer concerned with operational effectiveness. His job was to ensure his pilots performed their missions. When something interfered with that, he documented it. Third, there are the testimonies. Not from the pilots themselves, most of them died that morning, but from 2 escort pilots who were waiting on the tarmac, who saw the 12 selected pilots emerge from the ready room, who noted something different about their demeanour, and who lived to give accounts of what they witnessed. This is what happened. 4:30 hours. Pilot ready room, Kanoya Air Base. The 12 pilots arrive in small groups. They have been through the preliminary briefings already. They know their targets. They know their routes. They know they are not coming back. This is the formality before the end. The room is underground, a reinforced concrete structure. There are no windows. The walls are bare. There is a shrine, a small Shinto shrine in the corner, and a photograph of the emperor. That's it. No decoration, no comfort, just the minimum required for military necessity. The pilots sit. Some meditate. Some read. Some simply sit in silence. This is normal. There are no psychiatrists watching them right now. There are no observations being made. The procedures for pre-flight psychological assessment have already been completed. What happens next will surprise everyone, including Dr. Matsushita. Approximately 2:30 hours, all 12 pilots report the same thing. This is not something they discuss with each other. This is not a group hallucination triggered by suggestion. This is something that happens independently, and yet simultaneously to all 12 men. The phenomenon begins with a sense, not a sound, not a sight, but a sense. Multiple pilots later describe it as a pressure change or a shift in the air. The room's temperature doesn't change, the lighting doesn't change, but something changes. All 12 pilots feel it at the same moment. Then the apparition. It appears in the center of the room. The pilots describe it as a figure in traditional samurai armor. Not contemporary military uniform, not modern dress, but samurai armor, the kind that would have been worn centuries earlier. The figure is illuminated, though there is no visible light source. The pilots describe it as luminescent or glowing, but not blindingly bright. It is more like the figure is itself providing the light. The face of the figure is not clearly visible. Multiple pilots later report that the face seemed indistinct or obscured, but the general form is clear. It is the shape of a warrior. It is the shape of a samurai. The figure remains for what the pilots estimate as 2 to 3 minutes. During this time, it makes a gesture. The pilots describe it differently. Some say it raised its hand in a gesture of blessing. Some say it pointed. Some say it simply nodded. But all 12 agree that the gesture was one of approval or affirmation. And then the figure is gone. Not gradually fading, simply gone, as if it had never been there. The entire event lasts perhaps 3 to 5 minutes. When it ends, all 12 pilots are sitting in silence. No one has moved. No one has screamed or panicked. No one has run toward the door. They simply sit in the dim underground room processing what they have just experienced. One pilot, a young ensign named Nakamura, looks at the pilot next to him and asks, "Did you see that?" The other pilot nods slowly. Within seconds it becomes clear that all 12 saw the same thing. What happened next is where the documentation becomes crucial. Rather than suppress this event or dismiss it, the base commander did something remarkable. He ordered an immediate investigation. Within minutes of the pilots emerging from the ready room, they were all brought to the base medical facility. Dr. Matsushita conducted a rapid psychiatric examination of each pilot independently. He did not tell them what he was looking for, he simply examined them. What he found was extraordinary. None of the 12 pilots showed signs of hallucinogenic drug use. There were no dilated pupils, no behavioral changes consistent with LSD or other drugs that were available to the military. None of them showed signs of clinical delirium. None of them showed signs of severe sleep deprivation beyond what was normal for pilots preparing for missions. More significantly, none of them showed the expected psychological response to hallucination. If a person experiences a hallucination, if they see something that isn't there, they typically respond with confusion, with fear, sometimes with aggression or attempts to defend themselves. These 12 pilots showed none of that. Instead, they showed calm. They showed clarity. They showed, according to Matsushita's clinical assessment, a heightened sense of purpose and determination. Matsushita was trained enough to recognize that something significant had occurred, even if he couldn't explain what it was. He sat down and wrote it down. Dr. Matsushita's report. The document still exists. It was declassified by the Japanese government in 2001. Here is what Matsushita wrote, in translation. At approximately 2:30 hours on March 19, 1945, all 12 pilots assigned to Operation Sakura reported a simultaneous sensory experience in the pilot ready room. Each pilot was interviewed separately, without knowledge of what other pilots had reported. Despite the independent nature of these interviews, all 12 pilots provided nearly identical descriptions of the experience. A figure in traditional samurai armor appeared in the center of the room. The figure was luminescent in appearance. The figure remained visible for approximately 2 to 3 minutes. The figure made a gesture that all pilots interpreted as one of approval or blessing. The figure then vanished. All 12 pilots remained calm throughout the experience. No panic was observed, no distress was exhibited. Upon questioning, all pilots reported feeling a sense of clarity and purpose following the experience. Medical examination of all 12 pilots revealed no evidence of hallucinogenic drug use, no evidence of clinical delirium, no evidence of extreme sleep deprivation beyond operational norms, no evidence of psychological breakdown or dissociative state, consistent vital signs across all 12 pilots, no signs of contagious illness or gas exposure that might explain shared sensory disturbance. The consistency of description across 12 independent individuals, combined with the absence of clinical markers for hallucination, suggests that the pilots experienced a genuine external phenomenon rather than an individual psychological response. The nature of this phenomenon remains unexplained by conventional psychiatric or medical science. However, I note that following this experience, all 12 pilots demonstrated exceptional psychological stability and clarity of purpose. Their demeanor prior to the mission was markedly different from other pilots, calmer, more focused, more resolved. This suggests that whatever the pilots experienced, it had a significant psychological effect, and that effect was not deleterious to operational readiness. I recommend that this event be documented but not suppressed, as it may contribute to understanding the psychological mechanisms that enable exceptional performance under extreme conditions. What Matsushita was carefully not saying is very important. He was a trained psychiatrist. He knew the difference between hallucination and reality. He was not going to come out and say, "A ghost appeared in the ready room." That would end his career. That would make him a liability to the military. But what he was saying, carefully in clinical language, was that something real had occurred that could not be explained by psychology or medicine. The 12 pilots had experienced something external, something that affected all of them simultaneously, something that was real enough that a trained medical professional could not find any physiological basis for it being internal or psychological. What happened next is where the military response becomes unusual. Captain Yamamoto received Matsushita's report. Rather than classifying it immediately or burying it, Yamamoto did something different. He acknowledged it. Yamamoto filed his own report to the 5th Air Fleet Command. Here is what he wrote. On March 19, 1945, an unusual phenomenon was observed at Kanoya Air Base involving the 12 pilots assigned to Operation Sakura. The nature of this phenomenon is not fully understood. However, I note that it occurred approximately 4 hours prior to the scheduled mission. Following this phenomenon, all 12 pilots proceeded to their aircraft in a state of exceptional psychological calm and clarity. Prior to this date, we have observed that approximately 20% of kamikaze pilots scheduled for missions exhibit anxiety or hesitation in the final hours before departure. Some request reassignment, some experience nausea or vomiting, some show signs of acute fear response. In the case of these 12 pilots, none of these symptoms were observed. All 12 proceeded to their aircraft without hesitation. All 12 completed their assigned missions with confirmed successful strike. I recommend that further investigation into the nature of this phenomenon may yield insights into the psychological mechanisms that enable exceptional operational performance. The implications of what Yamamoto was saying are significant. He was not saying the apparition was real. He was saying that whatever happened had a measurable operational effect. 12 pilots who might have otherwise hesitated or shown anxiety instead showed absolute resolve and clarity. From a military perspective, that's not irrelevant. That's not something to suppress. That's something that works. So rather than classify this as a problem or an anomaly, Yamamoto classified it as a phenomenon worth understanding. But then the war ended. We know that 12 pilots reported identical phenomena. We know that the phenomena was documented by a trained psychiatrist, who found no medical or psychological basis for dismissing it as hallucination. We know that the base commander documented the phenomenon and reported that it had a measurable operational effect. We know that the American military was aware of the documentation and chose to classify it. We know that 2 escort pilots witnessed the 12 selected pilots emerging from the ready room after the phenomenon, and both noted that the pilot's demeanour was unusually calm and resolved. We know that all 12 pilots completed their mission successfully. What we don't know what the pilots actually saw. We have descriptions, but we don't have verification. We have consistency in description, but we don't have the experience itself. We don't know why a figure in samurai armour would appear to 12 20th century military pilots. We can speculate. Perhaps it was a manifestation rooted in their cultural consciousness, in the warrior mythology that had been instilled in them through military training and Shinto practice. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. We don't know whether the experience was external, something that actually existed in the room, or internal, something that occurred in the minds of the pilots but was triggered by an external factor we don't understand. What we do know is that something happened, something that was real enough to document, something that was significant enough to classify, something that defied explanation by the trained professionals who investigated it. The surviving testimony. One of the escort pilots at Kanoya Air Base that morning was a young pilot named Takeshi Yamada. Yamada did not fly the kamikaze mission. He was assigned to escort duty, to accompany the 12 selected pilots to their targets and report their successful strike before returning to base. Yamada survived the war. He lived to 1998, when he gave a recorded interview to a Japanese historical society. In that interview, Yamada described what he witnessed. I was on the tarmac waiting for the 12 pilots to emerge from their final briefing. It was still dark. The sun was just beginning to come up. I had done this many times before. I had waited for many pilots to emerge, but there was something different about these 12. When they walked out of the facility, they were different. I cannot explain it well. It was something in how they carried themselves. They were not nervous. They were not afraid. They were calm. They were resolved. It was as if they had been transformed by something. One of the pilots, I did not know his name, walked past me. He looked me directly in the eye and nodded. It was not a gesture of farewell, it was a gesture of understanding, like he was saying, "I know what must be done. I am at peace with it." I had never seen that before. In the months I had been escort pilot, I had seen fear. I had seen sadness. I had seen resignation. But I had never seen peace. Not like that. Whatever had happened to those pilots in the briefing room, it had changed them. They were no longer reluctant young men being asked to sacrifice themselves. They were warriors proceeding to a destiny that they had accepted. That is the only surviving first-person account from someone who witnessed the aftermath of the phenomenon. Why this matters. This incident matters because it represents something that the military, both Japanese and American, found difficult to acknowledge: the existence of phenomena that don't fit into our medical and psychological understanding. It matters because 12 people reported the same thing, and that consistency was documented and verified by trained professionals. It matters because the military response to the incident was not suppression through denial, but suppression through classification. The military didn't say it didn't happen. The military said it was too significant to allow public knowledge of it. It matters because it suggests that there are experiences that occur in human consciousness that we still don't understand, that there are connections between spirituality, psychology, and physiology that remain unexplored. And it matters because even now, even after declassification, the incident remains little known. The Western historical record of World War II does not include this. The general understanding of what happened at the end of the war does not include this, which raises the question: what else has been suppressed? What other incidents have been classified and then quietly released, only to be lost in the noise of competing information? The larger context. The Japanese military, in the final years of the war, became increasingly interested in what we might call non-conventional warfare. They were exploring the potential of psychological phenomena. They were studying the warrior spirit and how to cultivate it. They were integrating Shinto mysticism into military practice. This wasn't random superstition. It was systematic investigation, an investigation that produced results that even American military psychiatrists decades later had to acknowledge they could not fully explain. The Yasukuni Shrine apparition is one incident, but it's not an isolated one. There were others. There were other bases where similar phenomena were reported. There were other documented cases of pilots experiencing visions or sensory phenomena in the hours before their final missions. Most of those incidents remain classified or have been lost in archives. The Yasukuni Shrine apparition survived because the documentation was thorough, because multiple institutions preserved records, and because eventually enough time passed that declassification became possible. What the pilots experienced. Whatever the 12 pilots at Kanoya Air Base experienced on March 19th, 1945, it was real to them. It was documented as significant by trained professionals. It had measurable effects on their psychological state and their operational performance. Whether it was a paranormal manifestation, a mass psychological experience, a cultural phenomenon rooted in Japanese warrior spirituality, or something else entirely, that remains unexplained. But the fact that it occurred, and that it was documented, and that it was then suppressed, that is certain, and that is worth remembering. Before we close, I want to return to something I mentioned at the beginning. We've opened a Ko-fi page for direct support of this research. Every investigation like this one, every declassified document, every surviving testimony, every institutional record we track down, it takes time, it takes resources, it takes the kind of commitment that can't be sustained on algorithms and algorithmic favor. The link is in the description. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough to want to know the truth.